last week there was news that David Chapman was denied parole. Do either of you have any reaction to that?
Well, it's a very delicate and sensitive and difficult question to answer, and I just don't think I'd like to answer it now. I'm sorry.
Sure, it's not the kind of thing you can really answer simply. I mean, it's complicated, but let's just say that our lives were changed forever by that. So it's a sensitive sort of thing.
Especially for Sean, because Sean was so close to John, and suddenly John was gone. It was just a very trying situation.
Yeah, but I mean, it's too complicated to really make a simple statement about.
Of course, we understand. Well, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to episode 291 of Something About the Beatles podcast. If you've made it this far, then you know who the guest is and what the topic is. I would say to listeners who have been following this show for some time, perhaps you heard the conversation I had with author David Whelan earlier this year, March, I believe. That was something that I wasn't sure what the reaction would be in advance. I figured as these things go, there would be people that would dismiss his investigation into the murder of John Lennon out of hand. And there definitely were people that fit that classification. There were people who objected to it quite emotionally, which I also anticipated, and it's completely understandable. There were people that listened, perhaps were skeptical, wanted more information. That's cool, that's fair. And there were people that absolutely ran with it, that are inclined to see the world in conspiratorial terms. Now, I am not of that last category personally. There are things that I definitely see through my own research as at great divergence from an official narrative. And in the case of today's topic, the death of John Lennon, that is something, as I've expressed on the show before, that has never sat well with me. The official explanation, not because I have some kind of alternate explanation, but that the explanation we were given never seemed to add up to me. I think that people, humans as a species, we love stories. And we seek out logic and order to things. We look for explanations. Beatle world is full of that stuff. It's full of trying to understand the music, understand songs, understand their personal dynamics, and then try to fit the clues together in a way that makes sense, that provides an explanation for music or events or whatever you want to name. We look for clues and we try to fit them together in a way that now I understand, oh, this is John singing to Paul about this or something like that. The world is full of that stuff. Beatle fans are full of that sort of thing. And so it is with something as frankly unsavory and disturbing as the death of John Lennon. Criminal investigations are a little different. You could speculate away all you want and maybe find a logic in, well, this happened because this clearly was the reason that blah, 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 blah. That doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I think perhaps in this case, at best, you may discover through a series of data that this couldn't have happened this way because this, and this. But there may still be missing pieces of the puzzle to prevent you from arriving on solid ground with an explanation. There may be signposts that indicate, but are you ever going to know with 100% surety? I don't think so. So there'll be plenty of listeners that this will maybe make them angry that I'm having David Whelan back on the show, that a Beatle podcast is even tackling this subject at all. It's not pleasant, it's not joyful, it's not fun, it's not happy. Yeah, agreed. Absolutely. But I'm not of a bent to, once you know something, just leave it alone. You want to go further down the rabbit hole, and that puts me in parallel with David, who, when he started investigating this, doing the research and found things that didn't add up, kept going, as you will hear him explain. And it's like once you know something, there is, for some of us of a certain nature, you want to keep going and try to find those missing pieces, try to find something that makes it all add up. And that could be a challenge. Absolutely. So we have this discussion because I didn't feel we did his book full justice, his book Mind Games, The Assassination of John Lennon, which came out almost a year ago. There were plenty of more things he uncovered that we didn't get to. And quite frankly, with this conversation, we still didn't get to, because there's a lot there. It would take probably a few more conversations to really cover everything he's laid out in his book. But I did want to do this show in part because when I recently had author Robert Rosen on the show, author of Nowhere Man, and he's a friend of the show and a guy that knows how to do research and is certainly connected to Lennon world. He had a take that I thought represented a lot of people out there that questioned the premise and may be inclined to reject it completely, David Whelan's research. He said a few things, and David heard the show, responded to me. So really this show is sort of a response to Robert Rosen's response to David's earlier show that came in Robert's most recent appearance. Now some of you might be thinking, why don't you just get those two guys together to duke it out? Well, this is not Jerry Springer, but we'll see what happens. In the meantime, there is this. Now, again, to address listener reaction to the very idea of me doing this and dropping it on John Lennon's birth anniversary, no less. Look, I'm not here to sell a particular theory. What this is an inquiry. I think that if we revere John Lennon and his memory and what he stood for as much as Beatle fans claim they might do, depending on your own personal individual opinion, there could be no better way to honor him than to dig into something as big and important an event as this, to face some uncomfortable truths regarding the end of the man who's saying, give me some truth. I think that when you postulate something and you're not that individual, you can only guess. But I think John was the kind of guy that would want to know the truth if everything that people believe he stood for is valid. And this is something I think is valid, and that if people come to the false notion that to explore the circumstances of his murder is to somehow try to get his killer of record off the hook, to exonerate him, this isn't that. It's an inquiry, and you have to go where the data leads you. And in the case of this individual, there are a lot of really suspicious connections before and after that David has uncovered. So if all of this sounds to you like a bunch of nonsense, a bunch of tinfoil hat stuff equivalent with so much other stuff that is out there, it's not hard to find, I'll make this one suggestion to you. Something within reach. If you don't want to look at David's videos on his video YouTube channel, or you don't want to go to his Substack and read his articles, in other words, if you want to stop short of actually reading his book, but you are sort of vaguely curious about all this stuff, do this. Completely unconnected with David and his work or John Lennon, if you're a Netflix subscriber, look up the show The Octopus Murders. It's a docuseries. Check that out. See what they have to say there. It's a completely independent thing there. If you tough it out, watch that whole thing, which frankly is very disturbing and unsettling, I think you'll gain a greater understanding of the world that David Whelan describes in his book that exists sort of beneath the surface, in the shadows. That's really a good way, an accessible way, short of reading his book, which most people would find very disturbing, to sort of acclimate yourself to the notion of how something greatly divergent from the story we've been told could have happened that night 44 years ago. So, in its way, this show, this conversation, is seeking to honor John by trying to shed some light. It may not be a pleasant light, but it is something that I feel is worth our time and attention. We started the conversation sort of talking about this feeling of unease that looking into this case brings.
Some people just can't fathom that you didn't go anywhere near this kind of thing.
Well, it was of great interest to me once I became aware of it and then actually read it. And, of course, I've been exploring similar things for years and years with the political assassinations. This is something completely foreign to the thinking of the audience, which I pretty much got confirmation of that once we started going public with this. It was a pretty basic, non-confusing way, because people, I think, have a general grasp of physics and logistics, and they have a story in their head. It's been depicted in film, and just the way that they came to understand how it all went down. Chapman on the sidewalk 20 feet away, Lennon getting out of the limo, walking up the driveway, and then the shooting happens. So if you wanted to, for the sake of people that are new to the conversation, walk us through the official scenario and what is wrong with it based on your research.
Okay, we need to summarize it. I think, again, it's a good idea. The official narrative is fairly straightforward. John and Yoko were out on the night of Monday, the 8th of December, 1980, recording a Yoko Ono track. They came back to the Dakota where they lived at 10:50. They arrived. They pulled up outside the building. The limousine just pulled up quietly next to the sidewalk. Outside the sidewalk was the doorman, Jose Padermo, and Mark Chapman standing next to the driveway arches. And he was kind of not inside the driveway, but he was on the corner, on the edge of the driveway. As we look at it from the sidewalk, he'd be over to the left. Reports differ, but sometimes Yoko got out first, sometimes John got out first. I think Yoko got out first. Most official narratives stick with that. She walks towards the vestibule, which is in the far right of this driveway, down the end. And the vestibule is a little wooden porch area that leads into some stairs that lead up into the lobby that leads into their apartments. So that would have been where they should have been going. Everyone would have expected them to go there. Yoko goes out first. She walks past Mark Chapman. Then John exits the limousine. He walks past Chapman. And according to the official narrative and according to Mark Chapman, Mark pulls out a .38 revolver and shoots 5 times into John's back. And according to Mark, he hit John 4 times in the back. According to the official narrative, John was hit twice in the back, twice in the shoulder. It's slightly morphed away from back into shoulder now.
And at that's a reasonable description of somebody who's not a professional shooter aiming, 1 bullet missing completely of the 5 fired, and them scattered at the target area, but not with any great precision.
That's right. And then, according to official legend, John staggers into the building and collapses. Sometimes he collapses on the stairway. In some stories, he collapses in the lobby. The concierge, Jay Hastings, said that John made it all the way up to his front concierge's office, ran past Jay Hastings, stumbled, staggered. Sometimes the description changes. Says to Jay Hastings, the concierge, I've been shot. Then runs onwards into another back office and collapses down onto his, according to Jay's side, though all the cops who found John said they found him face down. Yoko, according to Jay, immediately follows John in after John comes in saying he's been shot.
So she's behind him in this towing?
Behind him. So I don't quite know how that figured out. She got in first, then John. So they seem to have crossed paths somehow. Yoko's statements have not really been made public. There was one that was made public in a 1990s book, which was a little bit confusing. I've read all 5 statements now. They're all a little bit different. So Yoko's given some varying statements about what she did and what she saw, though she doesn't really go into much detail about what she saw. And most pertinently, she's never said in any of her statements or any media interviews that she saw Mark Chapman shoot her husband, which I find very interesting. So that's the official narrative. Then the cops turn up. 2 cops arrest Chapman. At this point, Chapman apparently has dropped a gun. Sometimes it's been shaken out of his hand by the doorman. The gun has been kicked to the back of the driveway, would you believe? Someone then from a Dakota worker called Joe Manny comes up and takes the gun down into the basement. Very bizarre. The cops turn up, so there's no gun on Chapman when the cops turn up. So there's no smoking gun, as your last guest, Robert Rosen, said there was. There was actually no gun at all when the cops turned up. But anyway, Chapman's there now reading a book. He felt compelled to get a book out, the famous Catcher in the Rye. Officers Cullen and Spiro, the first officers on the scene, arrest Chapman and put him in cuffs. After Cullen goes inside to the office and sees John face down on a rug bleeding out, so he comes out and says to his partner Spiro, arrest that man, put some cuffs on him, which Spiro does. 2 other cops then arrive on the scene, Officers Framberger and Palmer. They rush into the back office, see John face down bleeding out. They decide that they should carry him out and put him in a police car and drive him off to the Roosevelt because they thought he was in such a bad way that he wouldn't survive waiting for an ambulance. So that's what they did. So they spoiled the crime scene immediately by doing that, which is a real shame to history. But possibly they, acted in good faith. We'll never really know. It was very rash, I think, what they did. But anyway, that's what they thought they needed to do at the time. They put John into an Officer Moran's car, Officer Moran and Gamble. They put John on the back seat. They sped off Moran and Gamble to the Roosevelt Hospital. This is still official. Moran has subsequently said that he asked John Lennon, "Are you John Lennon?" Which is just nonsensical, because I've spoken to Palmer and I've read statements from Spiro where they both said, when they put John in the back of Moran's car, they said it's John Lennon, and they radioed forward to the Roosevelt saying John Lennon's coming in. So why Moran then had to ask John Lennon, "Are you John Lennon?" when he was told this by two people. Gamble has never said, Officer Gamble, that Moran asked that question to John. So I very much doubt Officer Moran asked John if he was John Lennon. I very much doubt John Lennon said yes. I think that's complete BS, which we can get into maybe when we talk about how all the medical people who saw John said he died almost instantly from his wounds. So getting back to the official narrative, Yoko comes out. She gets into Framberger and Palmer's car. They drive her behind Moran's car to the hospital. They get John out of Moran's car straight into the ER, where various surgeons and nurses and anaesthetists try to save John. In vain. I think they probably work on him somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, trying lots of different things, lots of IVs. They tried to pump his heart. They tried everything really. In vain. He came in with no pulse. He was flatlined when he came in. I think they all agreed that he was dead when he arrived. But they tried in vain. I think Dr. Halloran has called it a Hail Mary pass, see if they could pull off some kind of miracle. But they couldn't. Then another doctor called Dr. Lin, who was the head of the ER, came out to the press and said that John had died from 7 wounds, which is an interesting phrase. In fact, we can talk about Stephen Lin because I've posted something quite pertinent from Stephen Lin recently, but we'll get back to that in a second. So Lin is then tasked to go and talk to Yoko in the hospital, which he does with nurse Barbara Camera. Barbara's confirmed that Lin did go and do this, though Lin has embellished what happened and what Yoko did. Lin said that Yoko screamed and banged her head on the floor. Yoko and Barbara both said that's not the case. She took the news in quite a dignified way, obviously weeping, but she wasn't acting crazy. David Geffen turned up, picked up Yoko, put her in the back of his car and drove her back to the Dakota. And that's pretty much the official narrative.
So the official narrative requires John being shot in the back from 20 feet away from Chapman, who is near the sidewalk, and also for him to be where he was found by the police arriving on the scene. He would have had to have gone through at least one doorway between the time he was shot and where he was found.
Yeah, it's important to note that. The driveway, Chapman has to shoot John in the driveway because we have people who've ID'd Chapman just before gunfire standing by the sidewalk. We have Chapman's own testimony saying he was just by the sidewalk. We also have witnesses who saw Chapman immediately after gunfire standing by the sidewalk. So we know where Chapman was. The police have said that John was shot by the vestibule. He has to be shot by the vestibule. He can't be shot inside the vestibule because Chapman can't see him in there. So everything that happens to John from a kind of fatal wounds point of view has to happen in the driveway. I think the official narrative has a big problem when you take into account the doctors and nurses and the chief medical officer, to be fair, Elliot Gross, who did the autopsy. They all pretty much agree on one thing, that death would have happened almost instantly to John with those wounds. I've never spoken to Elliot Gross.
Right. No talking, no staggering, no running.
No, he would have died almost instantly. There were 4 fatal wounds, tightly grouped wounds around his heart. It was a tight professional grouping, to quote Dr. Halloran.
And it's important to note that these are entrance wounds in the chest.
Yeah, and again, this is where it all starts to open up with my investigation, when I discovered from Dr. Halloran that they were entrance wounds in the chest, and there were 3 exit wounds out of his upper left back. And a direct line of fire, 3 passed directly through. The one that was near the upper left arm shoulder stayed in, but the 3 that were grouped around his heart were very tightly grouped together. One was slightly off. And they were very experienced doctors and surgeons and nurses, and they all said they knew the difference between an entrance and exit wound. I think it's pretty standard procedure that an entrance wound is much smaller than an exit wound. It blows out a little bit bigger, the entrance wounds. So they noticed the 4 small holes in the front and the 3 slightly bigger ones out the back. It's interesting to note that Mark Chapman was supposedly using hollow point bullets, but the actual hollow point bullets are not supposed to do what the bullets that hit John did, i.e. pass through. They're supposed to break up and stay inside the victim. So that's bullets that are not really acting in the way they're supposed to be acting if we believe Mark Chapman was using hollow point bullets. I managed to get a morgue receipt while we're on bullets. And in the morgue receipt, which is something that became a Mail Online story back in, I think, last year, 2023, maybe 2022, time flies. I noted that there were two different types of bullets. One was a semi-wad cutter and one was just an ordinary lead bullet that were found in the morgue, that were noted in the morgue receipts that Elliot Gross said he found. So there shouldn't be two different types of ammo in John. So that's a problem. To sort of verify that story, a photographer called Brad Trent did a story in the late 80s, early 90s, I think it's late 80s, about famous guns. And he got access to take a picture of Mark Chapman's gun, which the NYPD were very happy to leave him alone with, incredibly, in a room. And he also saw a little envelope next to this gun, which also had on it hollow point, non-hollow point. So that was a description of the two bullets. But luckily, Brad Trent actually got the bullets out of the envelope and put the envelope next to the gun and took a picture of these two bullets. And one is clearly a mushroom hollow point. Hollow point always mushrooms out when it hits a victim. And one is just a normal, small, non-hollow, non-mushroom lead bullet. So we've actually got the two bullets that Elliot Gross described as non-hollow and hollow. We've actually got a visual representation of these two bullets just to verify that piece of evidence. So it's very interesting that the NYPD, Manhattan DA's office, and the media have all made great capital the last 44 years of how callous Mark Chapman was. And this is something Mark Chapman thinks he had as well, of these hollow point bullets that were used to cause maximum damage to John. Interestingly, I've got most of the evidence vouchers from the NYPD. I managed to access first-hand documentation from the lead detective. One thing that's not in there is the empty shells that would have been found in Mark's revolver. And the bullets that should have been found on site are also not marked as evidence. They put the gun in there as evidence. They put some tapes and a tape recorder. So various things from the night on the scene were put into evidence. But for some reason, they did not put spent bullets in there. And I think that's quite telling.
Right. And was there any kind of effort made in official capacity to account for the bullet holes plainly seen in the glass in the photographs taken of the crime scene?
No. It's one of these things that's glossed over. No official account from the NYPD DA's office, or even the media, to be honest, shockingly, have ever said, what are those bullet holes doing there? How did those two bullet holes get in that glass door so low down? We're talking sort of stomach, waist height, these holes. And there's another hole in the far vestibule glass door, which I suspect is a bullet that went through the front door and then went into the back door. So I think there was two bullets that went into those doors. Interestingly, I spoke to the NYPD cops who attended the scene. I spoke to the concierge Jay Hastings, and I spoke to the lift operator Joe Manny many times, and they both confirmed to me, and all the cops confirmed to me, and the lead detective, that there was not one speck of blood on that glass panel door where those two bullet holes were, which you can kind of see in the photographic evidence that we've got of those doors, which is scant, but we do have a few photos. So if there's no blood, you have to sort of ask yourself, if we're going with the official narrative, John got shot in the back, two bullets passed through John somehow and dive bombed downwards. Are you trying to tell me that as those bullets exploded out of John's front, which is what the official narrative wants us to believe, that not one speck of blood followed those bullets? It's possible. It's possible. I'm not a forensic expert, but I find that very hard to believe that there wouldn't be one speck of blood on that door. And apparently there wasn't. If that's the case, and those bullets were caused by Chapman's bullets shooting John inside the vestibule, they're just in the wrong position. They're not in the right place. Certainly from where Dr. Haller and the nurses believe John was shot in his upper left chest. But if you actually look at the autopsy that the chief medical officer did the next morning, no one's ever officially seen it, but I've spoken to people who have seen it. And that's got two in the kind of left shoulder, upper left shoulder, left arm, one in the upper left back and one in the lower left back. So you can kind of go, okay, the one in the lower left back might account for one of those bullet holes, but the other three don't quite cut the mustard. So those two low down bullet holes in the vestibule door do not make any sense at all. They shouldn't be there, and they've never been explained away by an official storyteller.
Right. And what you're describing people having seen in the autopsy report doesn't make any sense either, because if there's a lower left back bullet entrance wound in the back, presumably, either it left an exploding bullet inside his body, which is not the chest if it's lower back, or there's an exit wound in his belly in the front. So what is the accounting of that officially?
We don't have an official account, Robert. This is the thing, because the autopsy has never been officially published, and that's perfectly understandable. It's a very, I've read other autopsies, and they're a very private medical record that explain all the biology of the patient. And it's a full-on medical account of a person and their body. So I understand why the family don't want that released. So with regards to an official account of what bullets were shot into John and where they went, there isn't one, which is kind of why I started this whole journey, really, Robert, was to try and find an official account. Because what I found when I first started digging into the famous doorman, and there's a lot of online chatter about the doorman being a CIA Bay of Pigs assassin, which he's not.
But he shares the same name.
Yeah, same name, very popular name, Jose Padermo. But everyone went down that rabbit hole, and that rabbit hole was the rabbit hole that got me interested in the case first. But I quickly discounted that he was that guy.
Right. A bit of a red herring.
Oh, big red herring that arrived from a journalist called Jim Gaines in 1987. But what I found when I started to move past the Padermo myth was a complete lack of detail. Where was John shot? What part of his body? What happened to John after he was shot? Because every single Lennon biography, Beatles biography, magazine article, of which since 1980 there have been hundreds, they were all different and they were all very vague. Often they just didn't go there. If we talk about Robert Rosen, he doesn't go there. He basically says, Mark got a gun out, John walked past him, and then he sort of flashed forwards to Yoko. So no detail. And that's what really got me. I was like, well, this is one of the most famous men who ever lived. Why do we not have details of how he died? And I get it. It was a horrible, brutal murder. I get that. But we've had 44 years now. I don't see why people could get squeamish about it now. I think people need to just basically start to forget about everything you've been told and just try and figure out yourself what Chapman could achieve, what John could achieve after he'd been hit. Look at the forensics on the ground. Look at the lack of evidence with regards to bullets. Look at the evidence that we do have with different types of bullets. Look at the conflicting statements that you get from Dakota workers. And then when you start to get into the background of Mark Chapman and who was surrounding him and what happened to Mark Chapman after he was arrested and who got into his cell, you just start to get this really horrible, well, I know I did, deeply unsettling feeling that something's very, very rotten in Denmark here and something's not right. And it was something, I said this before when we last spoke, Robert, I was just not expecting this. I really wasn't. It was a lockdown project just to kind of see if I could get my head around John Lennon's murder and see if I could figure out what really happened to him. And then once I started to talk to people like the surgeon and the nurses and the detective, I realized that this is something JFK-esque that's just really, really wrong on so many levels and deeply disturbing.
Right. And before we leave the topic of the forensics, clearly we don't have access to the autopsy report, although it's believed to exist to whatever degree of accuracy. And based on what you'd been told, it doesn't seem to jibe with what the emergency room doctors saw in the rather lengthy time they got to see, both in trying to save his life and then preparing his body and then having to unwrap it and then rewrap it up and examine it some more because it bled out when the medical examiner came in wanting to see it himself. So there's that. But then he was cremated within 36 hours, as you point out in the book, so we no longer had access to that as a piece of evidence to know exactly the story it would tell. What we do have today, I believe, because it's been known to exist in the last 40 years, is the clothing he was wearing, which would certainly, with the pattern of bullet holes, tell us something of value. Where it is now and will we ever have access to it, that might be the best evidence out there yet that hasn't really been examined in this context.
As long as I think we could see the clothing today, and I hope one day Sean will reveal that, or at least allow someone to look at the clothing today and assess it independently. What I'm wary of is a kind of JFK-esque, here's the images that tells us the whole story, because as you know, a lot of those autopsy images from JFK, the JFK case, were clearly doctored. The images that the Parkland Hospital saw in Dallas of JFK's head and brain, and the photos that we then got to see from Bethesda, from the Navy autopsy, the Parkland doctors all said, that's just not the person we saw. That's just not the brain. That's not the back of the head we saw. That's not the brain we saw. That's not the wounds we saw. So if these images do turn up, and I suspect they will, I hope they're very high res, and I hope they're very clearly documented as to where they came from and the provenance. And I hope they're very properly measured. I've got a feeling that won't be the case if they do turn up, the images of the clothes, but we'll see. We'll see. I don't want to prejudge that. I do think that the clothes are crucial evidence for sure, but only if we get to see them from now and assessed independently, away from images from the time. Let's put it that way. And it's interesting talking about photography, Robert. The autopsy should have taken photos, which was very much a common thing. It was a common thing in 1963 with JFK. I'm pretty sure it was a common thing in 1980 in New York. But there's never been any talk of photos taken of John Lennon's autopsy. So that would be very interesting if there are photos. But again, if they turn up, I would be very skeptical, and I'd want experts to look at them carefully. And I'd want the doctors and nurses from the Roosevelt to look at them and say, is this the wound you remember? Because again, going back to the JFK case, and there's a fantastic documentary I recommend everybody sees called What the Doctors Saw, which points out that what the doctors saw in Parkland is very different to what the doctors saw when they got the pictures from Bethesda. So talking of the autopsy, it was done by Elliot Gross as a chief medical officer who got the job in January 1980 to be the chief medical officer for New York. There was a guy called Michael Baden who was there in 1979. And Michael Baden was dismissed from the mayor's office in New York. Strangely, no one knew why. Baden didn't know why. And Baden was actually on the JFK Assassinations Committee in the 70s. So he was a guy who really knew his stuff. And I think he's a guy who would have given a very true autopsy on John. But Baden was basically kicked out of his post. He sued the mayor's office in New York, Baden, and actually won an unfair dismissal. So they had no case to dismiss him. But when they did dismiss him, they installed Elliot Gross. And unfortunately for history, Elliot Gross is a man who has been accused multiple times of falsifying autopsies, sometimes on behalf of the NYPD, not just in his New York medical officer capacity. He was actually accused of doing this in other offices that he worked in, and he had to move around. He eventually lost his job in the New York precinct because of those accusations. And then he went on to work elsewhere, where he was accused again of falsifying autopsies. So whether you want to put much store into what Elliot Gross said about John's autopsy or not, on that knowledge, knowing what he was like and what his background was like, well, that's up to you. For me, because of who Gross is with regards to those accusations, and we should point out for the record that he was never actually, it never stuck. It was always kind of the accusations. He always got off. It went to a hearing and it was like, well, okay, we can't really prove it, Elliot, but, this doesn't look good. And he was never really officially accused and prosecuted for it, but he was often moved around because of it. So I think Elliot had friends in very high places, is what I'm trying to say, in a very bad way. And he, as you rightly point out, he very strangely that night went to the Roosevelt very quickly, which is not what a medical officer is supposed to do. They sometimes go to the crime scene, but they never go to the hospital because there's no need to, because he knew he was going to get the body the next morning. But he was in a complete rush to get to see John's wounds, and he rushed to the hospital that night. He sort of arrived around about sort of 12:30, so it was half an hour into the next day, into Tuesday, and basically said to the nurses who'd washed and wrapped John, nurses Cameron and Sato, can you unwrap John, please? I want to see his wounds. And they had a massive row with him and said, why the hell are you doing this? You're getting his body the next day. This is disrespectful and ridiculous. We can't believe you're saying who you are, because no one has ever asked us to do this in all our time working here. It's just nonsensical. But he absolutely insisted that he wanted to see John's wounds immediately. When they unwrapped John and sat him up, what this gave the nurses another chance to do, luckily, was to see John's wounds yet again before they washed it the first time. So they sat John up, Gross walked around the body, didn't say anything, walked out. But he was in a very big hurry to see what kind of autopsy perhaps he had to do the next morning. And then the nurses had to re-wash John. So they got another chance to see his whole body, wash his whole body, front and back, and then they wrapped him again. So when those nurses say they know John Lennon's wounds, they know John Lennon's wounds. And they are both adamant that he was shot 4 times in a tight professional grouping in the front, with 3 passing out through his back. And that, unfortunately, is not something Mark Chapman can easily achieve.
Are there any witnesses that can actually say, or at least did as of 1980, that they saw him pull the gun and shoot John Lennon?
There's one. But there's possibly two. There's the door. There should be one, i.e. the doorman. The doorman should have seen it. Jose Padermo, you'd think. He's positioned there. He's got his gold booth right next to the driveway arch. He apparently often used to let the Lennons out of their limousine, open the door for them, and then they walked out. But here's the problem with Jose Padermo. Every single statement from every major player that gave a statement, and some people rather suspiciously didn't give a statement and weren't asked to give a statement that night. Amazingly, the concierge Jay Hastings wasn't asked to go to the station to give an official statement, which is very bizarre and strange. But Jose Padermo, I know, did go to the NYPD 20th precinct to give a statement that night. And I know he talking to or communicating with Kim Hogreth, the DA's assistant prosecutor at the time. He told me that, yes, Padermo gave the DA's office various statements over time, over that next 6 months. But the problem is the NYPD and the DA's office don't want to release Padermo's statements. They've released every other statement, but they are concealing JFK-esque files, concealing Padermo's statement. And I just do not understand why they're doing that. For me, that's quite suspicious. So let's discount the doorman because we just don't know what he saw because they're concealing what he saw. So let's get into the other witness who said he saw Chapman with a gun, and that's cab driver Richard Peterson. Now, I've interviewed Peterson quite a few times. He's an interesting character. On the night of the murder, what Peterson said at the time was, this is the statement he gave to the NYPD on the actual night of the murder, looking at the dates. He said he pulled up behind John and Yoko's limousine. He said his two passengers in the back were going to a party at the Dakota. They said to him, oh, look, there's Yoko, there's John, getting out of the limousine. He kind of vaguely looked up and saw John and Yoko getting out of the limousine as well. He then said he saw Chapman standing there. He saw Chapman get a gun out, and he saw Chapman firing the gun. And that's basically all his statement said. He didn't talk about Chapman's bullets hitting John. He didn't talk about, he basically just said that's what he saw. And then he said when he saw that, he got out of his cab and ran off for help. This is what he said to me subsequently. Got out of the cab, ran off for help, banged on lots of doors and said, please come and help. And then he said he came back to his cab, which was still there. And he said his cab was left there when he was then taken off by the NYPD with a doorman and a dog walker called Nina Rosen to give a statement. But here's the problem. Richard Peterson also said to me that not only did he see Chapman shoot Lennon, he said he then saw him take his hat off, take his coat off, get a book out and start reading it. This is all stuff that happened much later. It didn't happen immediately. Chapman didn't just do all this as an automaton. It would have been a bit of time. So if Peterson said he saw all of this, how could he see all of this and then run off for help immediately after hearing gunfire? The actual timelines don't add up. So Peterson's kind of getting his narrative a little bit askew with regards to time. But one thing Peterson did tell me, and he stressed this to me quite clearly, is that he never saw John being hit by Chapman's bullets. He just assumed that Chapman firing would have hit John because Peterson knew the Dakota driver really well because he was a very experienced New York taxi driver at that point. He assumed that John would have walked down the driveway and would have been close to the vestibule by the time he saw Chapman raise his gun and start firing. So that all kind of scoped, but he did say he did not see John getting hit by Chapman's bullets, which is very important indeed. But Peterson has embellished, unfortunately. Over time, he's mentioned that he heard Chapman call out to John, which is something that I'm no doubt he's heard other people say. He didn't say that in his original statement. That is not something that he said on the night. That's something that he's added over time. He's also added stuff when he was talking to me. He added stuff about John nodding at Chapman. When I asked him, did they interact? He said, oh, yeah, now you come to think of it, they might have nodded at each other. He's literally added that just as he spoke to me a couple of years ago now. And he said nonsensical things like, the police put Chapman's gun and John's bloody clothes in front of him in the police station that night. And when I know that John's clothes weren't there, they were with the nurses and they were sent off with John's body to the morgue to go to the chief medical officer the next morning. And I know the person who picked him up the next morning from the chief medical officer's office. So he's lying about the clothes. He's lying about the gun. I think he's lying. Well, I know he's lying, I think, about calling out. So Chapman's never said he did that. There's no proof that Chapman did do that. Lying's a bit harsh. Let's just say he's embellishing. Richard Peterson is a man who likes to embellish. Now, where Peterson is starting to become a real problem, in a recent Apple TV series called Murder Without a Trial, there's a Richard Peterson interview where the edit kind of makes out that he saw John Lennon get shot by Mark Chapman, but he didn't. He saw Mark Chapman raise a gun, He saw Mark Chapman shoot, allegedly, so he says, but he never actually saw John get hit by Chapman's bullets. But the way the Apple edit is put together, some viewers would be confused and think, oh, actually, he saw the whole thing. He did not see the whole thing. And Peterson is a problem because he's now become the number one witness who saw everything when, in fact, he was nothing of the sort. Just one last thing with Richard Peterson for people to consider. There are two witnesses, one in the building across the way from the Dakota and one in the Dakota. Two witnesses who both separately said that immediately after hearing gunfire, they looked out of their windows and they saw a yellow taxi cab screech off at top speed. And I suspect that was Richard Peterson. I think he probably heard gunfire. I think he parked his car up. And I think he came back to the scene. And I think he put together from talking to people like Padermo, potentially, people like Sean Strube, other kind of witnesses who came on the scene later, who embellished as well and added stuff. And I think he thought, this is my chance to put myself into history. And it's very interesting to note also, Robert, that I've spoken to Dakota workers and cops and said, do you remember seeing a yellow taxi cab parked up outside the Dakota after the shooting? And they said, no, there was no yellow taxi car parked outside. So Peterson's statement needs to be taken with a very large pinch of salt.
Right. Presumably, from the description, again, the official narrative, John and Yoko get out of the limo. The limo is still sitting there at the curb at the time of the shooting.
Apparently not. According to people that I spoke to at the Dakota, people who worked there and who knew the limo company, the way it normally worked was the minute someone got out of the car, there was no money exchanging hands. It was all basically billed later. It was a service that was a regular service. It wasn't like John and Yoko paying $10 for it. Basically, what normally happened was the way was whoever got out of the limo immediately, once that door was shut, just drove off to do the next job. They weren't going to hang around. And also, I spoke to Mario Casciano, who was May Pang and John's assistant, I suppose you could call him, who knew the Dakota quite well. Nice guy, Mario. He gave me an interesting piece of info. He said that it was actually the norm for the limos not to go up that driveway and drop them off the vestibule because it was quite tight, it was quite narrow. And if they drove up there, they'd have to reverse out, and it was a bit tricky. So it was the norm for them to be dropped off on the sidewalk. So there was nothing really sinister about how that went down.
On the subject of sinister, this is something that I don't think we got much of a chance to talk about last time we talked, but it is in your book. And that's the story of the bodyguard McDougal, and also the other bodyguards that were hired subsequent that Andy Peebles talks about, the BBC broadcaster who interviewed John and Yoko the weekend preceding. And he has since talked about that as well, as these bodyguards that were with them every step of the way. Let's talk about McDougal for a second and his interesting story of his employment at the Dakota, which basically he was Yoko's hire and she was the one that he reported to, and what went down in the months before.
Yeah, I mean, he was Yoko's hire, and by the time they started recording Double Fantasy, and he was an ex-FBI agent, and apparently a very serious FBI agent who I've been told by a source that wants to remain anonymous was part of a kind of black ops team for the FBI. So, and he was very much involved in counterintelligence with regards to Soviet agents in New York. So this is a serious dude, Scottish ancestry, big man, very capable, ex-FBI. So you kind of, the first question you've got to ask yourself is, why on earth did Yoko hire an ex-FBI agent when you consider just how horrendous the FBI made John and Yoko's life with all the men in black that were tailing them? I've been told that she kind of hired him because she wanted a kind of inside track on the FBI and what they might be thinking or doing. I just don't buy that. I just find the whole thing really bizarre, that hire. But what we do know is that once they started to record Double Fantasy in the summer of 1980, Yoko gave an interview to a magazine. And when I say we do know this, we're being told this by Lennon insiders who have got agendas. So when I say we know this, this is what is potentially the case. But there's no documentation here. I really need to put that out. But I think this is true. A lot of people have verified it to me. And that is that Yoko gave an interview to a magazine. Doug McDougal said, you gave away too many details in that interview about your comings and goings to the recording studio and when you leave the Dakota and when you go back to Dakota. It's a security risk. Apparently, Yoko then put him on a leave of absence at that point. That meant that by the time the assassination went down on December the 8th, they had no bodyguard with them. The wrinkle in that is, as you rightly say, Andy Peebles, a BBC radio DJ who I've spoken to, prickly man, not the nicest guy to talk to be honest, but he gave me a little bit of his time. He said, I think he was just bored of talking about it, to be honest with you, by the time I spoke to him. But he basically confirmed that, yes, there were two big burly bodyguards in the week leading up to the assassination that were always hanging around the Lennons. I said, are you sure there were two? He said, yeah, definitely two big burly guys in kind of blue blazer uniforms. He's adamant that they were just following them around to restaurants and bars and stuff. But everyone I talked to that were there, that worked at the Dakota, people like Mike Medeiros, Fred Seaman, even people like Dakota workers like Joe Manny and Jay Hastings, they say they don't remember two dudes like this shadowing the Lennons. So it's a real mystery. We do know that at the recording studio, there was a very big burly security guard that stood outside the door there. So I'm just wondering whether Andy perhaps got confused with that guy. But that's just one guy. That was just famously one guy. It wasn't two.
Was that studio security or Lennon's private security?
Yeah, studio security. So I'm just wondering whether Andy might have got confused with him. Maybe security in a restaurant, perhaps. You know, they apparently ate out a few times. Perhaps he thought restaurant security was maybe Lennon security. It's a mystery. It's a real mystery. But what we do know is there was no security when they got out that night, December the 8th. This has made a lot of people go, oh, Yoko planned it all. She stood the bodyguard down so John could be assassinated without a bodyguard to protect him. I can understand why people would think that, but there's no evidence for that. There's no evidence that Yoko was behind all this. But I can see why that is a problem for people. According to Fred Seaman, there was a diary entry in Yoko's diary the next day that Fred was due to come back to work on the 9th. We have to take Fred's word for that. They've got no proof of that. Fred's not shown the diary. From what I hear, and what I've heard from other people, understandably, Yoko, when she got back to the Dakota after the Roosevelt, said, call up our bodyguard, getting back to work. I'm terrified for my life. And we do know, got lots of different documentation of people's statements that when McDougall did get back to work, that night, that very night, you know, he came in sort of 1, 2 o'clock in the morning back to Dakota to start work. He brought in Pinkerton agents with machine guns and a lot of firepower that were walking around the hallways and the stairways of their Dakota residence, plural, because they had lots of different apartments, as you know. It was a bit like a war zone with like lots of kind of military Pinkerton agents just constantly around. I don't know how long they stayed there for, but you know, it went from sort of no security to a kind of Fort Knox set up very quickly. So it is very bizarre. And just to finish off McDougall, he apparently took his eye off Sean in Central Park the following year. Him and Yoko had an argument about this. He quit, apparently, and then he contacted Elliot Mintz and said he had some back pay that needed paying. And Elliot Mintz took the payment to McDougall, where he was living, which I believe was possibly Florida at the time, but I'm not sure. That might be where he retired. Don't know where he was living at the time. But Mintz said he delivered the money and he got back some items that McDougall said he had that he was keeping as a kind of leverage to get his back pay. So you'd think that'll be the end of McDougall's story, but I have heard, and I do have some documentation to kind of back this up, that he started to work for Lenono Music, the publishing side of the business, after that payment from Elliot Mintz. So I don't understand if that's true. It looks like it is true. Why Yoko would hire a guy who bribed her for some back pay and put her into a Lennon business arm like Lenono Music Publishing. Absolutely bizarre. What is McDougall doing there? He was an FBI bodyguard. What on earth is he doing? I was told by someone he just always wanted to work in the music business, but it doesn't make sense to me. None of that makes sense. So I think there's a hell of a lot more still to come out about Doug McDougall. A hell of a lot more to come out. He did have a partner called Richard Bates, who was a very serious FBI dude back in the day and was involved in the MLK case and was involved in the Patty Hearst case. So these people were high-end FBI agents. And I'm very troubled by the fact that he was in there, McDougall. It's unsettling that he was the guy that was hired, and it's unsettling that he has all these associations that just shouldn't really be there.
And he himself is beyond reach at this point for an interview.
Dead. Yeah, he died 2010 maybe. So yeah, unfortunately, we'll never know. I mean, he's got family. I've tried to reach them, but they're very difficult to reach. I think McDougall, there's more there for sure. And it's just so bizarre. The whole hiring an ex-FBI thing is something I still can't quite get my head around. Maybe Yoko thought she was being clever, by keeping the enemy close, as the old Godfather maxim says. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Maybe that's what she was doing. I wouldn't put it past her. She was clearly a very clever woman. Maybe that was part of her strategy. We don't know now. I hope we'll know more in the future. We'll see.
Right. And none of this is in any way trying to cast any aspersion or suggest that she was setting up her husband to be killed. It is something that's curious.
I don't think Yoko was involved. I really don't. There's no evidence for it. Simple as that. And I think the people who were behind Mark Chapman would have had nothing to do with Yoko Ono. That doesn't mean to say that she might have been compromised. At the end of the day, she was a heroin addict. She's admitted this throughout 1980. I suspect that took her into some dark places with regards to dealers and all the rest of it. So maybe, I wouldn't put it past her to be frightened. I'm pretty convinced Yoko saw, or at least thinks she saw, more than she's letting on that night. And I think she's not saying what she saw to protect herself and her son. I would not criticize her for doing that. So I find it very hard, all the different descriptions that she gives about what she saw that night. The statements are all completely different. Sometimes she's ahead, sometimes John's ahead. Sometimes they cross paths together. Sometimes she goes in after him, sometimes she doesn't go in after him. Sometimes John says he's shot, sometimes he doesn't say he's shot. It's all worryingly inconsistent. And if you look at all the interviews that Yoko's given about the murder, and there's only 3 or 4, she doesn't want to talk about it for understandable reasons. She basically stops when it gets to the limo pulls up, and she just then basically says, it was terrible, or it was awful, or dreadful, whatever. And of course it was. She's right. But no detail. Never any detail. And I suspect what she did, from what Lena Rosen said, who was a dog walker who came on the scene very quickly after gunfire, I think she heard gunfire. I think Chapman was almost certainly firing blanks. I don't think Chapman's bullets hit John. Or he may be firing real bullets, but I don't think that's the case. I think it's a Siren set up. And I think the minute she heard gunfire, she ran for the courtyard, which is an area beyond the vestibule, because she may have been standing by the vestibule door waiting for John, and the courtyard is directly behind that. So for her to duck for cover behind that courtyard gate would make perfect sense. I think John, hearing gunfire, would have stooped down, and I think he would have ran towards the vestibule for cover, thinking that it'd be safe once he got in there. And I think that's where he met his fate. And I'm not the only one who thinks that, because the lead detective told me himself in an interview that he thought John was shot on the stairway. And he actually intimates that in an interview that he gave outside the Roosevelt, which is a video which is easily found, where he says John was shot inside the vestibule, going inside the vestibule.
But have any idea what happened? He was leaving a limousine in front of him, arriving at home, and he was shot from behind in the vestibule of his apartment.
Talk louder, please.
No idea why. Not at this time. Altercation.
You have an assailant in custody.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
So, I think Yoko went to the courtyard, and I think all this stuff about Yoko following John in is just not true. I believe Nina Rosen. And I don't blame Yoko for doing that. I don't blame her for running for cover. And I think by running for cover into the courtyard, she probably saved her life. Because if there was a second shooter, which is the scenario that I think is the most likely, she potentially could have been shot herself.
Right. The question that people, even with the slightest familiarity with your book, or that may have listened to the show, the aspect that people find the most unbelievable, the most troubling, I think they can accept the logistic anomalies that we've talked about in this conversation, we talked about earlier, without really extrapolating the full meaning of it could not have happened the way we've been told ballistically. It does not add up. It does not hold water, which was always the thing that troubled me. But to then extrapolate from that a professional hit, perhaps with government involvement or rogue government involvement, the thing that people find the hardest to accept or wrap their heads around or make logic out of is, here's John Lennon in the autumn of 1980, living the right-wing dream, luxury high-rise, living with the banker's daughter in this luxury filled with fur coats and Egyptian artifacts and recreational drugs, and having been quiet for the last 5 years, he's not a target at that point if you're a right-winger. He's a demographic. Why would they want to go after him?
I would say I agree from a right-wing, whatever that means these days, but I know what you mean from referring to those times. He would be seen as a successful professional guy who'd made loads of money and was living in a very palatial place. I think you could do that and have left-wing values, to be honest. I'm not sure that's a completely right-wing imperative, but I get what you're saying. I do get what you're saying. And this goes along the same kind of line of, well, he was no threat because he hadn't done much in politics. And I agree, he hadn't. From 75 to 80, there wasn't a lot. There was no rallies in the street singing, "Give Ireland back to the Irish." It was none of that stuff going on. The Nixon stuff had died down. Nixon had fallen on his sword. John gloated at the Watergate hearings. He was in the crowd with his skinhead, buzz cut, smiling and smirking with Yoko. And, after that, he'd kind of won. He'd won his stay of absence. The Jimmy Carter years allowed him to stay and have his green card. He didn't have his citizenship at that point. That was coming up January 1981. So he wasn't quite there yet, but it was looking pretty good for him. I get people say I think there's other bits of stuff that we should focus on here. I hear people saying about the Fred Seaman thing that he was a Reagan fan. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. I think Fred has got that a bit wrong. Because when Fred said that in a Beatles documentary called Beatles Stories, the Fred interview where he mentions about John being a Reagan fan, he also mentions that John was winding up his uncle, Norman Seaman, saying that, he was going to vote Reagan, and the communism was rubbish and he was going to vote. And he actually said that he did that to wind up his uncle. And I suspect he did that to wind up Fred. It's just something I could see John doing, just going against what people expect him to say, i.e., I think Reagan's great and I'm going to vote for him. I just don't believe he would have done that. I think everything that John has done up to that point shows that he had no truck in right-wing politics at all. And the way, he went after Nixon so rapidly and the way they hated each other so vehemently, I just can't see John becoming a Reagan fan. I just think that's just total BS. You also get other people going, well, how is double fantasy a threat to the incoming Reagan establishment? John Lennon wasn't just double fantasy. John Lennon wasn't just a guy who was apparently baking bread for 5 years from 75 to 80. He was a music icon who had previous form. And he had previous form with a Republican president. He didn't have previous form for the previous 4 years, 76 to 80, because there was a Democrat president who actually was very benign and kind to him and allowed him to have his green card. And apparently, John was even invited to a dinner that Carter attended. So there was no problem for John then. There was no problem for the American establishment because the American establishment was a Democrat establishment that had no designs on misadventures, military misadventures in Central America, which we know the Reagan administration had designs on and very quickly acted on the minute Reagan was in power. I mean, I remember Robert Rosen saying in your last episode, how can people who supported Reagan maybe be behind a plot to assassinate John when Carter was the president? But I don't think Rosen's being very honest there. I think Rosen knows, just like we all know, that by the time John was assassinated, Ronald Reagan was the president-elect. He won the election. And we all know, as you rightly pointed out in that episode, Reagan and his people were organizing the October surprise at the time with the Iranian government, and Iran-Contra was just round the corner. So this was a deeply corrupt administration that was coming in that had a lot of military misadventures on their slate ready to go. I can easily see how people connected to that government. Clearly, Reagan wouldn't have been involved. He was just an actor in every sense of the word, in my opinion. But people connected to the Reagan administration, people connected to right-wing politics, people connected to financiers to the Reagan administration that were coming in would be deeply concerned about what John did to the last Republican, hawkish president, i.e. Nixon, and what he did in Vietnam. And I can easily see how they would take out a problem before it became a problem. And people say that John wasn't political, but he was due to attend a rally for Asian workers, I think a week after his assassination. He was due to go on a world tour. He was due to get his American citizenship in January. So the timing was very interesting for me, very pertinent that he was taken out just before this awful, corrupt administration got into power. And it's a corrupt administration that had the same politics as the last Republican president that Lennon hated. And that Republican president hated Lennon too. Remember, Nixon didn't go away. Nixon's in the background. Nixon hated Lennon. I think that's quite clear. And Nixon was good friends with Reagan. And it also, I think people, they always say whenever there's a theory about any kind of deep state operation or any kind of concerning piece of history that doesn't quite add up. They always say, oh, it must have been the FBI, it must have been the CIA, it must have been the NSA, it must have been Navy intelligence, it must have been the far-right fascists or whatever. It doesn't have to be one entity. And I don't think that was the case with the Lennon assassination. I think it was a group of separate people off the books. I don't think there's going to be any documentation. I think it's childish for people to think that once the JFK documents are released, that it's all going to be revealed. Why would they put it down in writing, what they did? Why would anybody document a conspiracy to assassinate John Lennon? Just not going to do that. And I think it would have been lots of different cells of people who all had one particular goal in mind, and i.e. that's to promote Reagan's hawkish right-wing agenda. And they wanted to take out a critic of that right-wing agenda before he became a problem. And I think that's exactly what they did.
Are you familiar with, and I would ask this of the listeners as well, something I saw in the last year? I had no preconceptions going in, but it was something that came my way, and I checked it out, and I was just blown away by it. It was a Netflix documentary, The Octopus Murders. Do you know what that is?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And for the sake of anybody who hasn't seen it, the parallels, in fact, I think I caught it right after our first conversation. It just fell my way. And so again, talking about the same sort of bad actors within the Reagan administration and this investigative journalist who was onto this story concerning the investigation and concerning computer software and how he got sucked into this deep hole investigating this terrible stuff that was going on and ended up being found dead as an apparent suicide that everybody who knew him said, no, he was not going to kill himself. And this happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I would suggest anybody who's skeptical of anything we've talked about, check that out and see what you think after. As something hard to wrap your head around, that there are people capable of taking out their political enemies.
Yeah, there are. And I think if those people have military and intelligence links, and a lot of people that were surrounding Chapman had military and intelligence links, and they were connected to Nixon and Reagan heavyweights, like Joe M. Rogers and Curtis Cooper and Stephen Alford, and Billy Graham, all coalescing around one man who basically has controlled Mark Chapman's life from the age of 15 to today. And that man is a man called Charles McGowan, who's a Navy intelligence, US Army heavyweight, counterintelligence heavyweight, a super spy, but he's also a preacher, very convenient. So he moves between God and war seamlessly throughout his life. But the people that this guy knew, that Charles McGowan knew, and he's on the record on video and in interviews saying that Curtis Cooper, a Pentagon Rand Corporation heavyweight, was his dear friend. Another man who was a war and peace guy, was another pastor who liked to dabble in war. And Joe M. Rogers was a good friend of his. And Joe M. Rogers was Reagan's main money man. Joe M. Rogers is the guy who funded Ronald Reagan. He made Ronald Reagan's campaign, successful 1980 campaign, happen. He got all the millions together from businessmen to make sure Reagan got into power. And Joe M. Rogers was very well rewarded after that by the Reagan administration. So Joe M. Rogers is friends with Charles McGowan, who has controlled Mark Chapman's life from the age of 15 to today. Now, some people might just go, oh, that's just a coincidence. But sorry, I'm not buying it. I'm just not buying it. There's one guy who is connected to people who are connected to very serious people in the Reagan administration, the Pentagon, and Richard Nixon. Now, I can't dismiss that. And I think what people still don't understand is that Mark Chapman was surrounded by right-wing preachers who had these military and intelligence backgrounds, not just Charles McGowan, there were others as well. And he was controlled from the age of 15 by these people and guided by these people. And I think most people have this perception, and I did initially before I got into this case. I had no idea Charles McGowan was. I was not expecting to find him. I was not expecting to find all his friends and associates with such clear links to the Reagan administration and the Nixon administration. But what people, I think incorrectly is that Mark Chapman was this kind of loser guy who lived in his bedroom and was listening to music backwards and just had no friends and just snapped one day and went out and shot John Lennon to become famous. That's just not the Mark Chapman story. It's not his story at all. The Mark Chapman story is very interesting. It's very unexpected. The things he did with money, absolutely no issue for him. He had unlimited funds to travel wherever he wanted, whenever he wanted, first class most of the time. And he had these connections to people who he should not be connected to. So the Mark Chapman story, it's not just about the forensics not adding up, the medical not adding up, and it's not just about the cover up and all that. It's also about who Mark Chapman was and who was behind him before the murder, and also very interestingly, after the murder, and how that cleanup operation was enacted. Because I think for me, that was a really telling point, because I don't think Mark Chapman was meant to live. There's two very interesting statements that came from Jose Padermo. One was told by what Chapman said Padermo said to him after the shooting, and one was by Nina Rosen, what Nina Rosen heard, the witness who came on the scene. Chapman said Jose Padermo came up to him and said, "Get out of here, just run, go away." And Chapman allegedly said, "I don't know where to go." So that's one where the doorman is telling Chapman to run. But Nina Rosen has put a bit more detail on that. And she says she heard the doorman say to Chapman, "The police are going to be here soon, run." That's a man pleading to someone to get out of there. At this point, Nina Rosen didn't see a gun. Chapman didn't have a gun on him. Padermo didn't have a gun on him. He may have kicked it to the back of the driveway. I'm not sure there'd have been time for Chapman to drop it or Padermo to shake it out of his hand and kick it before Nina Rosen got there. But there was no gun. So why didn't this big, burly Cuban doorman arrest Mark Chapman? Do a citizen's arrest? Shout out into the street, "Someone come and help me get this guy." Shout into Jay Hastings, who had his window open in the concierges, "Come and help me, Jay. Let's get this guy." No, he didn't want to do that, Padermo. He wanted Chapman to run, because I don't think Chapman was meant to stand there malfunctioning, reading the book where all the letters are jumbling over the page. I think he was meant to run, and I think there was going to be a Jack Ruby type character, Officer Tippett type character waiting, a bent cop or a bent nightclub owner, whoever, ready and waiting in Central Park or ready and waiting to see wherever Chapman ran to take him out, to shoot him, vigilante style. I saw this guy run at me with a gun, bang, problem solved. You got guys who saw him do it, you got guys who saw him run, you got a guy, a very brave guy who took him out on the street. How simple and effective that would have been, but it didn't work. And I think the minute it didn't work, to see the people scrambling to get to Mark Chapman is very revealing. And those two people that scrambled to get to him, one was his wife, Gloria Chapman, who's a very nefarious character who I think should have been charged with at least an accomplice to murder, enabling his plane tickets and driving him to the airport, and knowing that he previously went with a compulsion to kill John Lennon the month earlier. So how Gloria has escaped prosecution to this point is just totally beyond me. But she rang into the 20th precinct that night. Okay, she rang in before Chapman's name had been given to the press. She rang in at 2:30 at night, and the lieutenant officer of that station, a guy called Arthur O'Connor, said to the lawyer Fenton Bresler, the minute that phone call came in, he went, "This is a conspiracy. This is a conspiracy." Arthur O'Connor also said, "That guy looked programmed. He looked programmed to me. But we didn't drug test him, and we didn't look into a conspiracy because we had a guy. He said he did it. Christmas was coming up. We just wanted to make this an open and shut case." So Gloria was in a rush to see Mark. And the second person that was in a real big rush to see Mark was Charles McGowan, who was rung up on the night of the murder by a guy called Stephen Alford, a superstar, firebrand Baptist preacher from the UK, who was a mentor to Billy Graham. And Stephen Alford rang McGowan up and said, "Get into Mark Chapman's cell. I will fund your trip. I will put you up in my hotel in New York," because Alford ran a hotel that was connected to a church in New York. And he paid for all the costs. And McGowan rushed into Chapman's cell, and they put one of their preachers into Chapman's cell to keep an eye on him. Now, why did they do that? Because at that point, McGowan wasn't even Chapman's pastor. He hadn't been his pastor for 3 years. Chapman spent the last 3 years in Hawaii with another Southern Baptist pastor who also had military connections looking after him, while Chapman wasn't in his Castle Memorial Mental Hospital being brainwashed. So when people know all this stuff, when you see these people that are surrounding Mark Chapman, these people who should not be anywhere near him and should not be interested in him, why did Stephen Alford fund Mark Chapman's legal defense? We know, McGowan's admitted it, that Alford put money into his legal defense. Why'd you do that? Is it a Christian thing? Or is it the fact that Stephen Alford knew Richard Nixon and knew Billy Graham and maybe was part of the plot? Who knows? Alford's dead. Alford's got away with it. But Alford should not have known who Mark Chapman was that night, because Mark Chapman's name wasn't released to the press till the early hours of the next morning. So how did Alford even know who Mark Chapman was to ring up McGowan and say, "We need to go and help out our friend Mark Chapman"? These people should have nothing to do with Mark Chapman. But to this day, if you want to go and talk to Mark Chapman or communicate with Mark Chapman, you've got to go through two people. And ironically, it's still the same two people who were in a rush to get to him that night of the murder. Gloria Chapman and Charles McGowan. They are still controlling the Mark Chapman story and the Mark Chapman narrative. Sorry about that rant.
No, that's great. I wanted you, because we didn't get to this last time, and it's in your book, and I couldn't believe not only did she reach out to him and knew exactly where to call directly within the city of New York, this sprawling police network. She knew exactly what office to call before his name had been released. And that call was documented.
Yeah. And do you know how it was documented? Gloria admitted it on the Barbara Walters show in a soft focus 1990s, maybe even early 2000s, Barbara Walters interview with Gloria, looking all coiffured, smiling way too much, Gloria, way too happy about being interviewed. Gloria reveals that Mark Chapman made her record all her telephone calls. Didn't say why. She kind of made out he was some kind of paranoid husband. But we know now from Gloria that a tape that we've got of that call was provided by Gloria. Now, that had to have been an analog recording. You know, in those days, you didn't have digital automatic recordings in 1980. So there would have been a tape, there would have been a press and play, there would have been a stop. Gloria had to arrange all of that. Now, why did a panicked wife who's worried about her husband being accused potentially of a murder record a conversation with him into a telephone precinct that she should not have known he was actually arrested in? How could she even know it? It wasn't put out on the news that Mark Chapman's been taken to the 20th precinct. But Gloria knew exactly what police station to call into, what protocols to call into to get to Mark. And if you listen to that conversation, and I've put a transcript of it in my book, and you can hear a lot of it in different documentaries, it's just painful. It's exhausting. It's two people who are trying to get information out of each other without actually looking and sounding like they're trying to get information out of each other. Do you know what you've done? How are you feeling? What's going on? Have you called the police? Have you done it? And Gloria she lets slip. The facade comes down because she makes out, that no one's called her, but then she sort of briefly changes her story on that. And she constantly gets it wrong throughout this conversation. She constantly says things she shouldn't know. And it's just kind of, with Gloria, her lawyer has revealed that after Chapman went first to carry out his compulsion, as he called it, runaway train to kill Lennon in late October, early November in New York, when he came back from that trip, he put the gun and bullets in front of Gloria on a table and said, "I've just been to New York to kill John Lennon, but your love for me has saved me." Gloria decided at that point it was not a good idea to call the police or psychiatric services. And then she also thought in 3 weeks' time, when Mark said, "I'm going back to New York," it'd be a really good idea to book his plane tickets and drive him to the airport, where she has noted in one interview that he seemed really happy. Now, when the murder went down, a Captain Souza was sent out, was tasked, shouldn't say sent out, he was a Hawaiian captain, police captain. And he gave Fenton Brezza some interesting information. He said he was asked to look into Gloria and Mark. And he relayed to Bresler that when he tried to talk to Gloria and she wouldn't talk to him, he went back to the NYPD and said, "She doesn't want to talk to me." And they went, "Fine, just leave her. It's fine. It's not a problem. Don't harass her. Just leave her alone." So he left her alone. And she's just never been properly questioned about the murder since. So as far as I'm concerned, Gloria Chapman has some very powerful friends who have allowed her for 44 years to just breeze through the whole thing without being asked any awkward questions. And the official story with Gloria was that Mark came into a travel agent in 1978 when he was working at Castle Memorial Hospital, when Mark decided he wants to travel the world, as you do. And he went into the travel agents, and the official story is that he went in there, met Gloria, and true love blossomed, and she arranged this world trip for him. Mark went off on this world trip, which I'll tell you about in a little while. It's got some interesting details of that world trip. That's the story. It was kind of like a chance Bridget Jones meeting where Mark comes in and there's true love and Gloria's going to do. But actually, Gloria revealed in a recent podcast that when Mark first came into that travel agents, he didn't actually talk to her. He talked to one of her colleagues. And Gloria asked the colleague for Mark's name and number so she could contact him and she could arrange his world trip, not the colleague. She then revealed that they kept the correspondence up. And you can see some postcards in the documentary, all very kind of lovey-dovey, looking forward to seeing you when I get back kind of stuff. And when Mark got back to the Hawaiian airport after his 6-week global jaunt, where he took in Nepal, India, Japan, Europe, he went to Israel, he went to Geneva, it was literally a global tour. When he got back from that in Hawaii after a stop off in Atlanta, he said Gloria met him at the carousel and she was so desperate to see him. He didn't expect to see her. He was surprised to see her. She had a broken foot at the time and she had crutches, but she was that desperate to be the first person that Mark saw. She was there waiting for him at the airport. And from that day onwards, they started dating. And then a year later, they got married. And she has been in his life ever since. Some people could say she's handled his life ever since. I think I would very much go along with that particular take on their relationship. Well, we know she's handled his relationship. And another thing that Gloria has done since Mark got incarcerated, she has worked alongside 2 journalists, a journalist called Jim Gaines, who's definitely a journalist, a very top guy, used to work for People magazine, and a writer, can't call him a journalist, I think he's a writer, I can't find any journalist work he's done, called Jack Jones. In fact, I can't find much writing he's done, to be honest with you. Jack Jones is another Navy intelligence guy like Charles McGowan. I'm sure they don't know each other. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. But Jack Jones and Jim Gaines are the 2 journalists over the last 40 years who have basically laid out the Mark Chapman story, that he did it for this, he did it for that, it was catching the rye, it was he wanted to be famous. They just spun lies, and I dissected all their lies in my book in a couple of chapters, and I pointed out where these lies came from and what they were trying to achieve with these lies. But what's interesting is with these 2 guys is Gloria has helped them all along the way, and they both call Gloria their dear friend. Gloria paints herself as this wife who's waiting on the outside for Mark Chapman to be freed, and she's going to be there waiting for him. But while she's doing that, she's working avidly with journalists for 40 years to attack her husband. So it just doesn't add up. I mean, I contacted Gloria very early on in this process, a year in, and I said, look, Gloria, I sent her an email. I said, I've got loads of information on your husband's murder, loads of anomalies. I think you should know. I think we should talk. At this point, I thought she was a loving wife. And she emailed me back and she said, I've spoken to Mark. No, I didn't ask her to speak to Mark, by the way. I've spoken to Mark. We've both prayed and we've decided we're not going to go forward with your request to talk to you. All the best, Gloria. Which to me was kind of a state, was like, I'm in control here. And I think the Mark thing was her basically saying to me, if you want to get to Mark, and I found out this is true, you've got to go through me. And I'm not letting you get to Mark. And I'm not interested in your anomalies. And I've been told by other people that Charles McGowan has told Gloria not to talk to me. Charles McGowan, I think, is the guy who Gloria looks to for guidance. So I think if you're looking for the kind of who's pulling the Mark Chapman strings in the Mark Chapman show today, you've still got to look to those 2 people. And you've got to kind of ask yourself, why? Why are they doing that? Why are they actively, with Gloria, putting Mark down through journalists who've been obsessed by doing that for 40 years? And why is Charles McGowan still interested in Mark Chapman?
Circling back to her encounter with him initially at the travel agency and knowing, just judging by the behavior and things that she couldn't have known but somehow did and was very well placed, is it too much of a stretch to suggest, or at least ask the question, was she an asset?
We know her mum and dad ran a bakery in Hawaii, okay, quite a successful bakery. Her dad was quite a successful guy. I mean, he wasn't super rich, but they were comfortable. So you just wonder whether his dad with the bakery maybe had some military clients, potentially, so there could be a military link there. We don't know much about Gloria's background. She did reveal once in a Christian interview that she, in a Christian website interview, that she had an immoral life when she was a travel agent, traveling all around the world before she met Mark. She was a few years older than Mark, much more worldly than Mark. I don't know what an immoral life means. I think we can put 2 and 2 together there. So maybe she was compromised and maybe she was an asset. I can see, there's obviously clearly no proof of this, but I could see how people would believe that for sure. The problem with Gloria is no one has ever been allowed to get anywhere near her, and no one has ever bothered asking her any pertinent questions like, who are you? What's your real background? You know, there was talk of her writing a book. I don't think she's ever going to write a book. Gloria did a podcast, which I dissected on a Substack article a few months back. And she revealed too much, because the problem with these people is they just, once they start talking, they don't realize that someone like me is dissecting everything they're saying, and I'm putting the timelines together, and I'm saying, okay, well, you shouldn't have done that, and you weren't there to do that. And what's interesting, just getting back to Mark's global jaunt that he went on, money, no problem. What's fascinating about that jaunt is the first place that Mark Chapman went to, would you believe, in the summer of 1978 was Japan. And the place that he went to in Japan was a place called Mount Fuji. And do you know who else was staying at Mount Fuji at the exact same time?
The Lennons?
The Lennons, at a hotel at the base of Mount Fuji. John, Yoko, and Sean, just the exact same time that Mark Chapman flew out there. Is that a coincidence? Maybe. Heck of a coincidence, isn't it? Because we're led to believe that Mark's obsession with John, and I believe this is true, started in the summer of 1980. Okay, it's where it really started to kick off, and Catcher started to become an obsession. John being a phony became an obsession. But clearly, someone else had Mark on the John Lennon mission 2 years earlier. Was it a dry run? Was it just a coincidence? I mean, I just can't believe that's a coincidence. I'm sorry, I just can't. But what's interesting is, Robert, Mark's never mentioned it. Never, ever mentioned that he was in Japan at the same time as the Lennons. Big deal when they were in Japan. It was in all the media. It wasn't some kind of under the radar thing. Certainly in the Japanese media, it was a big deal. And then Mark, interestingly, in that world trip, goes to Iran, pre-revolutionary Iran, a place that was completely unsafe for American travelers at that time. There was demonstrations and government fights with protesters on the streets all over Iran in 78. And Mark just walks in there. Why was he there? Why were you in Iran, Mark? And you could say that it's got this kind of vibe of a kind of agent, of a guy who's playing a kind of, I'm an agent, I'm being sent off to do work for the government. A bit like Lee Harvey Oswald in a way. Sent off thinking he's doing something, but he's actually being manipulated into another area that he's not aware of. I'm going to probably do an article soon where Mark has intimated to certain people that he was a government agent. I've got a statement from someone that he spoke to in a hotel. It could be just someone bragging, but he basically says, I'm an agent working for the government. Now, that could just be a sad loser having a fantasy. Or there could be more in it. Maybe Mark did think he was working for the government. And someone who has unlimited funds to travel all over the world, to me, that just smacks of being an agent to me, especially when you end up in places like Iran. Or he went to Geneva, he went to the United Nations building in Geneva. You know, he went to Israel, he went to London, he went to Paris, Dublin. It's easy to say the countries that Mark didn't go to. How did he afford that? He was a janitor working at Castle Memorial Hospital. Always got to follow the money. You know, he was working at Castle Memorial Hospital. I mean, according to Robert Rosen in his book, Mark Chapman was an art dealer. That's just a complete lie. He wasn't an art dealer. And according to Robert Rosen in his book, that's how Mark Chapman got all his money. He was a wheeler dealer in art. The evidence doesn't back that up, Robert, I'm afraid. That's just not true. He bought one artwork. He then traded that in for another artwork. He then sold that artwork. And who knows what he did with the money for that? We don't know. Apparently, he got the money from the world trip through a credit union at the Castle Memorial Hospital, although they won't release any records to back that up. But yeah, Mark Chapman was not an art dealer who could have loads of money through his art dealing. And for Robert to say that is just laughable.
The talented Mr. Chapman, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a new one. Mark Chapman, the art dealer. No, that's not who he was.
What do you make of, just slightly off topic, but something I've been wanting to ask you going back a ways, was there was that Sean quote back around 1998, I think, if I'm remembering the date correctly, where he's giving an interview and he says, anybody who thinks that my father was killed the way it was explained is just naive. And of course he was a target and there were dark forces, blah, blah, blah. I'm completely paraphrasing, but the gist of it was he was completely on board with it being an assassination, a government, whatever broad brush painting, whether it was nefarious bad actors or the government as a whole. He absolutely believed his father was a political hit, his father's assassination, and then dialed it back. And apparently, I remember the press at the time, Julian slapped him down saying, know what you're talking about before you open your mouth, something like that. And I've not heard a word out of him since on the subject.
Well, yeah, he definitely said it. You can find the article in the New Yorker. It's on record. I'm not sure about Julian I haven't had any verification. I've heard that Julian told him to dial it back and you shouldn't be saying stuff like that. And I've heard that Sean apologised, though I can't find anywhere in writing where Sean did apologise. So I think all that might be a slight invention. But Sean certainly said it in 98 and he's not said it for 26 years since. So he clearly believed it then. He was coming out of his first album, so he was talking to the press. And he was obviously a lot younger then, and the Lennon billion-dollar fortune wasn't quite in his sights at that point. He was more kind of focused on his music and being a musician. Now, I think the Sean Lennon of then and the Sean Lennon now, I think between then and now, we can only surmise, but I think he's probably had some discussions with his mother. He's had some discussions with his wife and friends, and they went, you know what? Do you really want to be bad-mouthing the American government? Really? Is that a good ploy? Do we need this, Sean? I think he's wise. I've got a lot of time for Sean Lennon. I think he's an incredibly clever man, very funny man. I love hearing what he has to say. I think he's very insightful. I think he knows more than he's letting on, and I think he's very clever not to let it on. If there can be a group of people that can put together a plot to kill JFK or RFK or MLK or Lennon or whoever, I'm sure they could take out Sean Lennon with ease. Or as you talking about, the octopus guy. It's not difficult to kill someone. I still can't believe people think Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. If you want to get to someone, they can get to someone. So I think Sean's been very clever. I think he does believe what he said in 98. I think he probably still does believe that. I've had no communication with him. I'm certainly not going to reach out to Sean. It's not my place to do that. I'd love him to reach out to me, and I would happily, in confidence, tell him everything I know, share with him everything I've got. Without a doubt, Sean is the person that I think could definitely take this forward. But maybe he's thinking, I don't know, what is it? What would he be now? 49, is he? 49?
49, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he's very comfortable. I think he's doing a great job with the packaging of the music and keeping his dad's name out there. Does he need the hassle? Does he need to look over his shoulder? He's probably he's thought, are the people who took out my dad ever going to be taken to book? No, they're not. When have you ever seen an intelligence agent put in front of a court? It
Right.
just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. If you work for an intelligence agency, you're pretty much immune. And I think Sean knows this. So what's the point? When you do this kind of work, you don't sleep that well, to be honest with you, Robert. When you're shining a light on dark forces, you don't sleep great. You do look over your shoulder a little bit. You do put extra cameras in your home, and you do be a bit more careful about things. And I think for someone like Sean Lennon, he must have a lovely life. He must have a fabulous life. So why does he need it? Why does he need the hassle? I hope when his mother dies, and I think that's another point we should point out here, that his mother never wants to talk about the murder. Who can blame her? And he's very protective and loving towards his mother. So I think until she goes, he's definitely not going to say anything. I think maybe when she passes, he might look at it again. I'd certainly be up for talking to him. I'm pretty sure he knows more than he's letting on. If I can find all this stuff out, Robert, I'm pretty sure Lennon can, or get people to find this stuff out. So I think he knows more than he's letting on. And I think when his mother passes, I hope he'll let us know what he knows or support an investigation into his dad's assassination, because as my book points out, as the lead detective told me, as Arthur O'Connor stated, there was no investigation. They had their man. It was a slam dunk. There were no men in white suits. That Dakota driveway was open the next morning. They spoiled the crime scene. I've had detectives contact me, proper detectives, who said they're shocked at seeing those pictures of detectives just walking all over the driveway and the vestibule, basically spoiling the crime scene. You need to have a path away from that. But none of that happened. The vestibule doors should have been taken into evidence. I know from Joe Manny, he told me within a few days they were thrown in the basement, which is where Joe worked. He said they were thrown in the basement. And then he said the glass disappeared a few days later. Then the door handles apparently disappeared. And then the actual doors disappeared. And that was that. Gone. Whether they went to a souvenir hunter or whether they went to a rubbish dump, I don't know. But at the end of the day, they didn't go to the NYPD. They didn't go to the DA's office. And Chapman didn't have a defense. There's another thing I think people get wrong here. They think, well, surely his lawyers would have found out stuff. No, his lawyers didn't find out stuff. His lawyers made it quite clear in the new Apple documentary, or one of the lawyers in the new Apple documentary, David Suggs, who was an assistant helping Jonathan Marks. Chapman's second lawyer private lawyer who should never have got the gig, but the public lawyer who did get the gig got so many death threats after 2 days he decided to leave. Very ominously, he said to New York Times, if you knew what I knew, you wouldn't want to be involved in this. So I just think someone really scared his first public lawyer, Herbert Adlerberg, off with some pretty heavy stuff. And if Herbert Adlerberg was Chapman's lawyer, we wouldn't have people like CIA Manchurian candidate hypnotist Milton Klein getting into Chapman's cell. I'm pretty sure about that. So they had to get rid of Herbert to get access, to get the nefarious guys into his cell, to get the hypnotists into his cell. And there were many hypnotists, not just Klein. There was a whole bunch of them. And once Jonathan Marks took over, he got David Suggs to help him out in 30 Rockefeller Plaza, the building they both worked out of. But David Suggs worked for a company called Donovan, Newton, Leisure and Irving. Donovan, Newton, Leisure and Irving was a CIA law firm set up by Wild Bill Donovan, the man who actually set up the CIA. One of the directors who used to work, CIA directors who used to work at Donovan Newton was William Colby. The place was awash with spooks. David Suggs will not deny this. David Suggs then went to work with Jonathan Marks. Now, I'm not saying Marks and Suggs are CIA spooks. I'm not saying they did anything nefarious, but you've got a clear link between a CIA law firm and Mark Chapman's defense. And what Suggs gives away in this Apple documentary is he actually says it on camera. Well, we knew he did it. It was just a case of, was he mad? So right from the word go, they were not prepared to defend Mark. They weren't prepared to look into it. They did no investigation. I know they didn't do an investigation because I know people who knew what Marks got up to at the time. They said he had no detective. He went over to Hawaii, Marks, and he didn't bring a detective with him. So whoever he spoke to had no one to verify what he heard. So he went over there for a holiday. He didn't go over there to look into what Chapman was up to. You know, Marks basically was a waste of time when it came to being a defense for Mark Chapman. So Mark Chapman did not have a defense. And what we can't get away from is that Jonathan Marks and David Suggs put in CIA hypnotists in the guise of Milton Klein, who was a consultant for the Manchurian Candidate CIA program. And they put him in his cell multiple times. Now, there's a fantastic clip in that Murder Without a Trial Apple series where a journalist actually says to Marks, on the first day he got the job, Marks is going, I'm sending in a psychiatrist. Milton Klein didn't mention the CIA bit. But a journalist actually did his job that day. And he said to him, isn't Milton Klein a hypnotist? And you can see the uncomfortable look on Jonathan Marks' face. And Jonathan Marks says, yes, that's part of his skill set. But why is that skill set required to go and interview Mark Chapman? Why is that required? But then the next day, Marks decides to go public because he's been busted now. And in the front page of the New York Times, you can see it. Killer to be hypnotized. He had to go public because he got busted by that journalist. And from that point on, you've got people like Milton Klein, Bernard Diamond, who was a psychiatrist / hypnotist who worked on Sirhan Sirhan. So you've got a link back to the RFK assassination. You've got people like Richard Bloom, all military intelligence-linked hypnotists, piling into Mark Chapman's cell and shutting the door. Now, sometimes they recorded their conversations with him. Sometimes you've got Chapman going, oh, yeah, I did it because I wanted to be catching the ride, blah, blah, blah. And you can hear this on documentaries because these tapes were given by Jonathan Marks to Jim Gaines because apparently they were going to write a book together. And Jim Gaines and Jack Jones, who then went in after Jim Gaines and did a lot of other recorded conversations with Mark, they've made a lot of money and a lot of capital out of these recorded tapes. But we don't know what we're not hearing. We hear certain bits after Mark's been hypnotized, by the way, by some of the most nefarious hypnotists who ever lived. So can we actually take what Mark's saying as true? Or is this something that he's saying under hypnosis? We just don't know because there was no independent person in there looking out for Mark's interests. It was basically hypnotists that are linked to the CIA. They almost like they must have had a sign above the door. Mark Chapman's cell this way. In you come, guys. Help yourself. Shut the door. If you want to record some stuff, that'll be great. And if you record it after you hypnotize him, that's fantastic. Don't worry. We're not going to ask any questions. But if you can get stuff about Catcher and he shot him and he's evil, that'd be great. That'd be quite useful. So you can get him to say that. Fabulous. And then those tapes were given to Jim Gaines, and Jim Gaines went and gave those tapes. And he's still giving those tapes out to documentary companies today who use it to prove that Mark Chapman admitted that he did this and he did that. Yes, he did admit certain things about the killing, that he shot John, but he still doesn't go into detail, Robert. He still doesn't say, I shot John and I hit him in certain places. And once I shot John, He then went off and did this walk and walked into the vestibule. Mark can't do that because Mark has no real idea about what he actually did when he shot John Lennon. I'll give you an example. This is a statement that Mark gave on the night of the murder, okay, at the 20th precinct, okay? Now, this is before people like Milton Klein and Bernard Diamond and Charles McGowan and all these characters who are military CIA linked, intelligence linked people managed to get into his cell. So this is what I call Mark Chapman Unplugged. I never wanted to hurt anybody. My friends will tell you that. I'm paraphrasing. I did not want to kill anybody, and I really don't know why I did it. I fought against it for a long time. But for a few seconds, the small part of me won. I have nothing against John Lennon or anything he has done in the way of music or personal beliefs. I came to New York about 5 weeks ago from Hawaii, and I didn't want to do it. I went back to Hawaii to try and get rid of the small part, but I couldn't. Here we go. Now we get to the murder, okay? I then returned to New York. I stayed one night. I went to the Sheraton, blah, blah, blah. Then this morning, I went to the bookstore and bought The Catcher in the Rye. I'm sure the large part of me is Holden Caulfield. The small part of me must be the devil. Went to the building, stayed there until he came out, and I asked him to sign my album. At that point, my big part won, and I wanted to get back to my hotel, but I couldn't. I waited until he came back. He came in the car. Yoko passed first, and I said hello. I didn't want to hurt her. Then John came, looked at me, and printed me. I took the gun from my coat pocket and fired at him. I can't believe I could do that. I just stood there clutching the book. Where's the gun? I didn't want to run away. I don't know what happened to the gun. I just remember Jose kicking it away. Jose was crying and telling me to please leave. Why, Jose? I felt so sorry for Jose. Then the police came and cuffed me. Now, every detail about the murder that we've now been told, shot in the back, 4 in the back, 1 missed, not there. But the other detail that's not there is what John did after I shot him. Now, there's a clip, one of these nefarious pastors, because it wasn't just McGowan and Alford and whoever they put in. There was other horrible right-wing pastors who got into Chapman's cell. There was a whole exorcist demon thing they did on him and exercise him, trying to make Chapman think he was possessed by demons. It's probably a story for another podcast, Robert, to be fair, that whole demon gaslighting they did on him. But one of those exorcist guys got into Chapman's cell and he started to film him. And he wanted to do what he would describe as the Mark Chapman TV show. And this video, which I've got on my YouTube channel, is very interesting. He actually asked Chapman a really interesting, pertinent question. He says to Mark, so what did John do after you shot him? And Mark sort of goes, I don't know. I guess I must have turned around at that point. But I've been told he went in and ran in. So he couldn't actually describe what is happening to the man that he's allegedly shooting and what that man actually did while he was shooting him and immediately afterwards. Why can't he do that? Why can't Mark Chapman ever describe that? If he's doing this thing, you'd think he'd be able to recall what he's doing, but he can't. It's almost like after he thinks he shot him, he doesn't know what happened to the gun and he doesn't know what happened to John. Now, does that strike you as a cold, calculated killer? Or does that strike you perhaps as a brainwashed guy who's been hypnotized to think he's doing something he's not doing? I would say it strikes me as the latter.
This definitely is a lot of stuff for another conversation we haven't even touched on yet. We didn't touch a whole lot on MK Ultra, which I would like to come back to.
Oh, my God.
I did want to ask you, because somebody brought this up. I was aware of the book, but I hadn't read it, which is why I hadn't mentioned it in either my conversation earlier with you or with Rosen. It's the book Chaos. Is that something you've read?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. It's a great book. I've got to know Tom fairly well through correspondence and emails and stuff, and we follow each other, and I'm aware of his work. He's aware of mine. I've sent him my book. I think he's great. I think the sort of general thesis of what Tom O'Neill found out was that when the Manson family and Charlie were going to a sexual clinic in Heights Ashbury, I think it was called the Heights Ashbury Clinic, and there was a kind of sexual disease area that they went to. Someone else that was working in the same building was a CIA MK Ultra heavyweight called Jolene West. And there's kind of evidence that Jolene West, one of the main players in the MK Ultra hypnotist kind of sphere. And I think the case that Tom is putting across is that Charlie Manson, through his Jolene West learnt skills, actually hypnotized his family and his followers to go and do these nefarious acts, probably through a COINTELPRO or an Operation Chaos, whether you go FBI, CIA, counter left, divide and conquer kind of strategy to sort of terrorize the kind of hippie, left-leaning kind of drug culture society that I think a lot of people like Jolene West, who's a military man, of course, would have despised. And people like we know, Hoover despised it as well at the FBI. No doubt the CIA bosses were the same. So it's a really interesting book. He's got documentation from that clinic that Manson and his family followers were all in that proves that Jolene West was there. He doesn't actually marry up the fact that West and Manson met. West was influencing Manson, but they were certainly in the same building at the same time. And there's a whole backstory with the Beach Boys and Dennis Wilson and the music business and that whole kind of Laurel Canyon setup. It's a fascinating book about a very dark time with that kind of LSD coming into the counterculture in the late 60s, where the CIA, we know, were sort of experimenting with various drugs to try and see what the effects of LSD could do as a kind of truth serum. Again, just to pull up Robert Rosen here from your previous podcast, which I've not had as much chance to do as I'd like to do. He mentioned that one of the reasons why MK Ultra didn't work was because they were using LSD, heroin, and I forget the other drug he said, ecstasy. Yeah, they did use those. There's documentation that they did try and use those drugs in the early MK Ultra experiments. But he's being a bit disingenuous there, Robert, because they also use a lot of other drugs. It wasn't just those drugs that they were using to try and control people through hypnosis. They certainly were using something more like thorazine in conjunction with hypnosis than ecstasy or heroin, which just would not work, of course. I can see why he would state that they were unstable, but they weren't the only drugs, of course, that the MK Ultra operatives were doing. And another thing I have to, while we're talking about MK Ultra and Robert Rosen, he mentions that Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the MK Ultra program at the CIA, after he was found out and was pulled up in hearings and stuff, admitted that he was heading up this disgusting, nefarious mind control program, and then got into gardening and spirituality and Buddhism. And somehow Robert seems to think that means he's a good guy that we should believe when he says that, oh, no, it didn't go anywhere. Don't worry, we didn't get anything out of it. Is Robert asking us to believe that a CIA man who was the head of a top secret MK Ultra program that was only revealed through accounting files that they didn't manage to shred because they tried to shred all the files. Richard Helms tried to destroy all the files at the CIA. So God knows what we won't know about that program. We only know what we know through these accounting files that managed to avoid the coal. Are we being asked to believe that the guy who headed that up, if he tells us that nothing came from it, that we're supposed to take his word for it? That's just laughable. Absolutely laughable. So I'm slightly concerned why Robert wants to downplay Milton Kline and say, did he work for the NYPD? Did he work for the DA's office? No. It doesn't take much to figure out that he was hired by Mark Chapman's defense. So he certainly wasn't working for those entities. And of course, you rightly pulled him up when he said that I was potentially lying about Milton Kline, that Milton Kline's background and his participation in the Chapman story has been well documented by lots of other people. So I think if Robert is going to debate with me in the future about MK Ultra and Milton Kline, who he had a bit of amnesia about, didn't he, initially, saying he didn't remember who he was, and then suddenly you reminded him that we talked about him quite a lot in different podcasts, and suddenly he remembered who he was. If he wants to get into that, he needs to do a bit more research, and he needs to stop coming out with ridiculous assertions that MK Ultra was a failure because the guy who ran it said it was a failure. That's just not going to cut it, I'm afraid. So I do look forward to a potential debate with Robert, but he's going to need to up his game a little bit, I think. If he wants to talk about MK Ultra, he's going to need to do a little bit more research, and I'll leave it at that.
That's a conversation I very much look forward to having on this platform.
Yes.
Yeah.
Me too. There's one bit of news I just want to say before we go.
Oh, yeah. Okay, please.
There's one interesting visual medical document came to my attention about a year ago now, maybe 6 months ago. I don't remember now. A guy sent it to me. So a Lennon memorabilia collector. And this guy wanted to have the bullets. He's a tattoo guy. He wanted to have the bullets of John's bullet wounds on his body in the exact position that John was shot. So a few years back now, probably about 50, maybe 20 years ago, he wrote a letter to Dr. Lynn. Now, Dr. Lynn's the lying doctor. He wasn't the actual doctor who tried to save John Lennon's life, but Dr. Lynn was in the room Everyone's confirmed that. He was standing in the room and saw John's wounds from the front. Probably didn't see around the back because he wasn't there when they were turning him. But he definitely saw John's wounds from the front. I'll give Dr. Lynn that. He was in the room. And because Dr. Lynn had told everybody at that point that he was a doctor, this guy wrote Dr. Lynn a letter saying, I want to do this tattoo of John's bullets on my body. Can you send me an illustration of where John's wounds were? And what's really interesting is Lynn did this. He sent this guy a drawing of a body, of a chest and arms and head, and he put the bullet wounds on there. Now, why this drawing is important is because the actual ER report on the night that Dr. Hannah and the nurses made out, which actually showed front and back entrance wounds and exit wounds and had a little report underneath saying where the arrows, wherever all the bullets were and stuff. That went missing on the night of the murder. Strangely, has never been seen since. So someone made sure no one was going to get hold of that document. So to actually get a drawing from someone, not from the time, but it was in the room, who kind of sent it to somebody who was not involved in the media or writing a book. He just kind of, Lynn sent this, is what he recalled. And what Lynn recalled was 3 bullets in a tight grouping, or he didn't say professional, but he showed a drawing of 3 bullets just around John's heart in a tight grouping, and one over on his upper arm, sort of mid-arm. I'd say he got that bit wrong. I think it's probably his upper arm. But isn't it interesting that Lynn didn't show back wounds? He showed 3 tight bullet wounds around John's heart. The nurses and doctors want nothing to do with Lynn, and they probably would be unhappy that I put a picture up that Lynn drew. They'd see that as misinformation. But I did find it quite interesting that Lynn actually drew the bullet holes almost exactly where the doctor and nurses said they saw them. So I thought that was quite, and you can see that on my Twitter, Lennon Murder. I put it up on Instagram and TikTok, and that's interesting. A little bit still seep through. Little bits of info are still coming through, and I think there's more to come.
Just a short while ago, Chief of Detectives for the Manhattan Borough, James Sullivan, came out of the Dakota. He had just finished surveying the scene. He had just talked with witnesses and with several of the policemen who had responded earlier when John Lennon was shot. And he told reporters what had happened. At the very beginning of this tape, which I'm about to play for you, the first words he's saying, which are kind of off mic, are John Lennon and his wife had just returned from a recording studio. I'll let him take it from there.
Oko Uno had returned from a recording studio and had alighted from a limousine at this point. We're not sure if the limousine was inside the driveway or if it was outside on the street. They went into a little vestibule inside, and as he was walking through the vestibule, this individual, who is unidentified at this point but will be identified soon, fired 5 shots from a .38 caliber Charter Arms pistol. Mr. Lennon was struck several times. We're not positive at this time as to how many times he was struck. He went up the stairs. There are 5 steps that lead up into the watchman's area of the Dakota. He went through that area into an office inside, where he collapsed to the floor. A radio car responded to this location and took him to Roosevelt Hospital, where he expired. Right now, I'm going to go to the station house and talk to some of the witnesses and see if we can put some more details together so that we can give you a fuller account as quickly as we can. It appears at this time that the individual is from out of town, possibly Hawaii. That's the way it looks at the moment.
Was he a witness at the time?
I haven't spoken to the witnesses at this point. I can't tell you that. No, she was not.
What is the race of the
No, I think he's a male white.
How long had he been hanging around here?
We don't know that. Some people say a couple of days, but we're checking that out also. We're not sure.
Had he been reported before as a threat?
Not to my knowledge.
So there you have it then. That is Chief of Detectives James Sullivan at the Dakota, where he interviewed police officers regarding what had happened to John Lennon. As you heard earlier, when Robin Sagan and I reported from the hospital, John died of significant injuries of the major vessels inside his chest. This man apparently knew where he was aiming, and he aimed at his chest, and there was massive blood loss, and he was dead on arrival at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital. And that's the scene from the Dakota. I'm Mona Rivera.
Something About the Beatles, created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez, executive producer Rick Way, title song performed by the Corgis. Something About the Beatles is an evergreen podcast.
The fact that he was too honest may have offended some people, may have really shortened his life. I don't know.
You think his lyrics might have in some way
I don't know
Chapman
what
to
offended anybody, but he was very upfront, extremely kind of open to people. I think that sometimes you have to pay a high price for it, and he did it. He just gambled on it, I think.